Welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International, or MAGI. This guild's mission is to promote the highest professional and academic standards in Masonic research, education, and publications. To further the guild's mission and to reach a wider audience through its podcast journal, MAGI is pleased to partner with one of its sister historical organizations, the Masonic Library Museum Association of North America, or also known as MLMA. I'm Glenn Visscher, president of the Masonic Library Museum Associations, and in this episode, we move even further across the United States and continue our exploration of museums and libraries with an interview with Tim Winkle, who is the curator, Division of Home and Community Life at the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Hello, Tim. It is wonderful to spend some time and to chat with you about these museums and libraries that allow us to be immersed in both our history and our future.
Well, thanks, Glenn. Thank you for having me on. It's great to be here.
It's really a pleasure. Now, to start out, can you please give us a bit of background on the museums and libraries of the National Museum of History at the Smithsonian, especially those related to Masonic experiences? And please make sure you let us know where they're located and how our listeners can visit or experience your collections.
Well, sure. Okay. So the National Museum of American History is part of the Smithsonian Institution. So we're located on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The museum itself opened up back in 1964, but some of the collections here in the museum date back to the early decades of the Smithsonian itself, and that includes a lot of the Masonic and fraternal material. Now, within this museum, there's really 5 main collections of fraternal material. The first is held within the Community Organizations collection, and that's in my division, the Division of Home and Community Life, where I'm the curator for that collection. We have about 500 Masonic and fraternal objects, so it's really the largest collection of fraternal material here. And that ranges from aprons and jewels and regalia all the way to decorative arts, lithographs, all that kind of physical objects, material culture. The Division of Medicine and Science has dozens of fraternal pins and badges within their collection of 19th century celluloid. The Division of Military History is where they keep all the edged weapons, so that's where you would find fraternal swords. The Photographic History collections have several 19th and 20th century images of Masonic activity. And then finally, the Archive Center here at the museum has a unique compilation of material that's related to American business and enterprise, and that's called the Warshaw Collection. And in that collection, you can find things that are related to commercial aspects or organizational aspects of fraternalism, like supply catalogs or promotional ephemera. And of course, we have a library system here, Smithsonian Libraries, operates across the whole of the institution and has dozens of titles related to Masonic and fraternal history and material culture. We're open 364 days a year. And of course, anyone who's interested can reach out and contact us to set something up. If you want to do that, I would recommend searching just the phrase Contact Curatorial Affairs NMAH, or if you're interested in the archives, Contact Archive Center NMAH. And that search should bring up all the forms you need to reach out and arrange something. Now, here's just one thing to keep in mind, though. We're based here on the mall in the city. Most of our collections are kept off-site. And that's especially true for fraternal Masonic artifacts. This can take longer to access. It's possible sometimes there might be, at least temporarily, inaccessible. So it's a good thing to call, obviously, a good time ahead, give us time to organize things. But we also maintain a public database with nearly 2 million records. And that's often really the best way to start exploring the collections. And I'll give you the website for that. Our search page can be found at www.americanhistory.si.edu/collections. And likewise, if you want to access the Smithsonian Library System, that website is www.library.si.edu. So those are 2 good ways to approach it.
Great. Great. I have loved every time I've come to visit the museum. It is a fabulous place to go. My one question to you is, what's the one day of the year you're not open?
Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. Okay, great. All right, next question. How about your own personal journey? What did you do to become a curator at the National Museum of American History?
Well, it was not direct. I will tell you that. So after I graduated from college, I went on to get a master's degree in popular culture studies at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And while I was there, I took a job working in the library special collections at the Brown Popular Culture Library. And then after that, after I graduated with my master's, I worked for a bit at Virginia Commonwealth University in their library system. And then I actually moved to London. And while I was living in London, I worked with another special library collection. This one was focused on 20th and 21st century poetry. So I kind of figured I have to do something with all this education and especially all
Right,
this library experience, right?
right, right.
And so naturally, I took that and got a museums degree. I often wonder if I should have taken the more obvious path and gone into library science, and who knows where I'd be now. But
Right.
I decided, no, I'm going to get my MA in in museum studies, and that's what I ended up doing. And after that degree, my first professional job was with the Library and Museum of Freemasonry at
Okay.
United Grand Lodge in London, and that's where I really started developing a specialization in Masonic and fraternal history. And then jump forward a couple of years when I moved back to the US, I managed to land a job here at American History as a project assistant, processing an enormous donation of firefighting material. I had
Hmm.
no background with firefighting, but I had my degree. I had a lot of museum experience, and so that's how I ended up with that job. And so I'm doing that here at the museum at the Smithsonian. And then while I was doing that, I affiliated with Alexandria Washington Lodge, number
Hmm.
22, here locally, and became their assistant archivist. And eventually I became their archivist.
Hmm.
So at the same time I'm working with all this fire material, I'm also continuing my education in Masonic material
Hmm.
culture at the lodge. And then finally, after about 5 years on the processing project, I was hired as a full-time curator by American History to curate the fire collections. And since I had all this background in Masonic museums, I was also put in charge of fraternal collections,
Hmm.
which is really, really the first time there's ever been a curator at the Smithsonian specifically tasked with collecting the American fraternal experience.
Right. That's amazing. I love that story. It's very cool, and I'm sure you've seen some pretty amazing things, which we'll
For
talk
sure.
about a little later. So, to all of our listeners who are interested in being involved with the library or museum, what kind of things do you do on a larger scale? What's your larger scale duties for the museum, and what do you do an average day a week? Do you work on your own? Do you have a staff? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So every day can be different, and I wear a lot of different hats and do a lot of different things.
Hmm.
So I work within a division of 7 to 8 other curators, and our division specifically focuses on the everyday history of Americans and the everyday material culture of America. And we work in concert with the museum's collections managers, designers, project managers, fabricators, educators, and even social media folks to do all types of things. Obviously, as a government organization, as a large museum, we have a large amount of staff, and so there's lots of different opportunities to work in lots of different, teams and
Hmm.
groupings. So usually, I'm involved with a team that's developing at least one exhibit. That can be a really long process. That can even take years in the making. Right now, I'm working on a team that's putting together the what our exhibition will be for the 250th anniversary next year in
Okay.
2026. But at the same time, I'm always working on other projects. So I could be bringing in donations or acquiring new objects. Um, all of our acquisitions have to be documented and approved. So I'm often writing a report or a memo to justify a new accession,
Hmm.
especially if it's one that we're purchasing.
Right.
Um, Sometimes I'm working to catalog objects, either new ones that have just come in, some of these acquisitions, or I'm improving records for existing objects. Um, Sometimes I'm writing a blog or developing a talk or a presentation. Sometimes, like right now, I'm being interviewed.
Hmm.
I also big part of the job is answering public inquiries, of course. We get lots of requests either for donations or for information about things that people have. Sometimes I'm researching a topic or an object, and that's really my favorite part, the history detective part. But then I'm also always doing a lot of paperwork, and that's not my favorite part. And on top of all that, there's work on committees and other forms of museum service. So it's a pretty mixed bag. I'll give you an example. When I started in museums, when I worked for Grand Lodge in London, I was a cataloger, and I cataloged and photographed objects all day long. That's pretty much all I did. Now it's just part of what I do. If I catalog an object once a month, that's about right. So, depending on your specialty, depending on the focus, and depending on what's a priority at the moment, it can be different every day.
Yeah. That sounds fascinating. It's just the amount of things that you get exposed to it's amazing. I'm very impressed. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about some of the interesting pieces of your collection? I'm sure there are countless numbers of this. How did you come by them? How do you handle them, preserve them, display them? What's the most favorite you have? I know there's no such thing as a favorite. It's kind of like having a favorite child, but
Right.
What do you like?
Well, like you say, we've got tons of interesting objects here in the fraternal collections. And some of those have been in the collections for over a century. And there's some that I've acquired just while I've been here. In the last, I'm getting on 20 years here. So I'll give you an example of each of those, right? So in the early 1900s, we received a donation of family heirlooms from a woman named Cassie Julian James. And she was a sort of Washington area socialite, I guess you would say. And she was one of the two women who spearheaded the creation of the First Ladies collection here at the Smithsonian, one of our most popular exhibits. Now, her grandfather was a man named Mordecai Myers, and he had served as an officer in the War of 1812. And then later he'd served as the mayor of Schenectady, New York. But within New York, he was also a significant Mason. And he was a founding member of Washington Lodge 21 in New York City. And he had served as the deputy Grand Master of New York for many years. And he even became Grand Master. There was a schism in New York at the Grand Lodge level, and he became a Grand Master on the group that had split off. And he was later recognized as being a legitimate Grand Master by the Grand Lodge. So this is a really important New York Masonic persona, this guy, Mordecai Myers. And Mrs. Julian James donated his sword and other military pieces, but she also donated his Masonic regalia and his jewels. And so it's through his granddaughter that we have his past master's jewel from Washington Lodge 21, where he served as worshipful master 1802, 1804, and 1805. So it's this wonderful early American piece engraved to him. We have a history and documents, wonderful piece. And that was just because all this family material came in. We did not acquire it because it was Masonic, because of him. It was one of these things where we get a big donation and we sort it all out. And that happened in like 1922.
Wow.
Now, I have another piece from the same place and time as this first Masonic object that I talked about. And this is the first object that I acquired in my time as a curator. It's a mark medal. It's from Holland Lodge in New York City. And it's for a man named George Anthon. Anthon was a German medical doctor. He had actually served in the British Army in frontier Detroit during the Revolutionary period, actually. And he had moved in his later years to New York City. And he became a trustee of Columbia University and the New York Lying-In Hospital. And he was kind of a medical bigwig in his latter years. And he affiliated with Holland Lodge in 1789. So at some point he had been made a Mason, and he is listed as having affiliated in 1789. He becomes a Mark Master Mason in the same year in Holland Lodge because it was a part of the lodge system then. And he commissioned this Mark medal, from a man named Peter Rushton Maverick, who is also a member of Holland Lodge and
Mhm.
a well-known New York engraver. And anyway, it's this really cool coin that's got an engraving on both sides, has his mark, has his initials. And I purchased this object from an antiques dealer in order to bolster our representations of 18th century Freemasonry, which
Mhm.
we didn't have, we still don't have loads, but we have good representation.
Right.
And so these two objects, one that we got, 100 years, 100 plus years ago as a family donation, and one that I sought out, are basically it's two Masons from New York City who would have no doubt known each other,
Hmm.
certainly probably knew each other fraternally.
Wow.
One's younger, one's older, but their Masonic careers overlap by like 20 years.
Mhm.
And they give us a material um, culture look at what Masons were producing in the early Republic, but it also gives us the stories of these two men as well, and the
Mhm.
makers for this. But
Mhm.
Peter Rushton Maverick is an interesting fellow too. So that's just an example of the kind of things we have, and both the kind of things we have, but also the ways we get things.
Mhm.
Donations and purchases tend to be our main ways of acquiring.
Right.
Now, how do we handle things? How do we display things? Well, let me go back to these two objects. They're both silver, so that's great.
Mhm.
Because they're silver, I've been able to display them both at various times and for long stretches of time. Um, the Past Masters Jewel was part of our philanthropy case. That's called Giving in America. The Mark Medal was out for several years in a timeline introductory exhibit that we called American Stories.
Mhm.
And we have silk aprons and we have printed certificates and things like that. But even with the best environmental and lighting conditions,
Yeah.
these materials can only be on display for a little while, right?
Yeah.
And we try and be very mindful of that and very strict about it. So more durable objects like these silver pieces or like ceramic jugs or wooden gavels, these tend to be the fraternal objects that if they're on display, the public sees the most. And I
Mhm.
suspect that's probably the case in a lot of Masonic museums and
Right.
collections. Um, and these can be displayed longer, so they tend to be out more. They tend to be the workhorses of collections, as it were.
Mhm.
So naturally, when these pieces are in storage, they're secured in locked cabinets. And here's where we really rely on our collections management programs, right? Our electronic catalog to track them, to update their records, to approve them for conservation for loan. And of course, that system is linked to our public records. So anything I change, anything I update, anything I improve on those records instantly becomes there for the public to absorb as well. So
Mhm.
that's really good. And it's really important, obviously, too, that because these are both high value but really portable objects, right?
Mhm.
A little silver coin size thing and a jewel that they're both real high value. They can be picked up pretty easily. So obviously we have them under good lock and key. And like most metal objects, we
Mhm.
would never think to touch them without gloves, right? Don't want to
Yeah.
leave
Yeah.
fingerprints on them. So those two objects kind of give you an example of like the kind of things we do every day, how we get them, how we
Right.
store them, how we track them. And nowadays, a lot of it I can do from my desk, right?
Yeah.
Thanks to computers.
Yeah.
But there's no replacement for going into the storage areas, right? And to really get into the objects. So you asked me if I had a favorite, and that's obviously hard to pick. But I'll give you there's one that has a really good story attached to it, and it is one of my favorites. And I'll
Mhm.
tell you that story because it kind of is another example of some good areas of museum practice to focus on, right?
Mhm.
So um, this is even before I was a curator. This is while I was working on the fire project, and we were offered a printed silk apron by a donor who said it belonged to George Washington.
Mm.
Get that? That's kind of comes with the territory, right? A
Yeah.
lot of things, both Masonic and non-Masonic, that Washington touched, Washington wore, Washington owned this.
Yeah.
Not uncommon. Well, we kind of had to take it seriously because the person donating was actually a descendant of one of the two men who purchased Masonic regalia from Washington's estate in 1802. This is documented by Mount Vernon. They have the records, and so we know there are these two gentlemen,
Mhm.
and this person was indeed a descendant of one of them. So it's like, oh well, maybe it could be.
Mm.
And we couldn't dismiss the claim out of hand. Now, looking at the apron, it certainly looked like maybe it was early 19th century.
Right.
Um, but we really wanted to make sure, and we really wanted to answer it, you know, the put the question to rest. And so working with one of my colleagues who was a textile conservator, we used our lab equipment to do high magnification scans of the fabric. And we discovered in doing that the backing material was machine woven. And,
Mm,
and that meant that it couldn't have been made earlier than 1815. So that puts it out of Washington's lifetime. He dies 1799. It's 16
right.
years later at earliest. And so with a little technology and a little research and a lot of experience, especially from my colleague, the textile conservator, we were able to find the truth. And but the greatest thing was that the donor still donated the apron. And the neat thing is that because it was meant to have been Washington's, that family had kept it in great shape and treasured it for 2 centuries basically. And so it may not have been his, but because of that legend around it and because of the care that was taken, we now have an almost perfectly preserved example of a printed silk apron from roughly the 1820s. And that's really valuable when you look at the overall material history of Freemasonry. That's just as valuable to have this one perfect example as something that might be George Washington's, right? It tells us more about the topic than it does about, say, a celebrity, or a well-known member or something like that. So I love that one in that we did a lot of detective work. We put a lot of effort into it, and we still got this great result from it. So that apron's definitely one of my favorites.
That's really amazing, and it is true that when you get some items, you never know what you're going to find.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes, it's nothing what you expect. You did bring up something about the aprons that I did have a question about. Well, you say that you don't keep aprons out in display very long. What's the typical timing you have for displaying aprons?
There's no there's no real rule of thumb. I wish there was. So if you asked one of my conservators who works here, they would say it's object by object, condition by
Hmm.
condition, right?
Hmm.
And that's very true. And it's definitely true about different materials. Silk is one of the worst things you can put out in
Right,
terms of
right.
light damage, whereas some synthetics are better or other organic materials are better. Um, but in general, from my experience, I tend to have a rule of my own personal rule of thumb, not speaking for my conservators or the institution. I tend to like to take something that's silk off display after 3 months,
Hmm.
unless it's in very special lighting conditions or something like that. If it's under
Right.
normal light, then yeah, 3 months is probably good because it starts to fray and shatter.
Yeah.
Um, Painted material can be the same. Other textiles can be the same. Costume and regalia can be the same.
Hmm.
So, you know, it's always good to consult professional conservators if possible. But if not, it's always best to err on the side of being really conservative about these things. We also tend to let things rest for a while,
Hmm.
because you're really, every time you have something out, it damages it.
Yeah.
And there's no going back with that. So we tend to not put anything back out that's vulnerable like that for about a 5-year period.
Hmm.
So it's really important for us to um, utilize other examples. If we're putting on a display, making sure that we're creating something that isn't hanging entirely on one particular
Yeah.
vulnerable object that then once it's gone, the whole thing falls apart in terms
Right.
of the labels and the topic. So a paper is very similar as well. Um, but then, like I say, more durable things like ceramics, metal, glass, those are the things that can stay out almost indefinitely.
Hmm.
So it's good to have a kind of a mix of these things, right? Something
Yeah.
that's always there, and then the ability to kind of rotate a more vulnerable object through, so you can tell a fuller material culture story.
Yeah. Yeah. Understandable. So, what do you feel like your greatest successes and the biggest challenges for you as a museum and library professional?
Uh, well, I mean, for me, measuring success is kind of,
Hmm.
subjective, but I would say the ability here at American History to incorporate Masonic and fraternal stories and objects into the history conversation, right? To actually have them valued and to have them contribute to the overall look that we're bringing to American history. So we're a national museum, and we tend to tell big national stories that can span centuries. And so it's been my goal to show that American fraternalism is one lens, one perspective in which we can view those stories, right? It's an additive. It can lend context and value to any American story practically. So I mentioned the past master jewel that was on display in our philanthropy exhibit, but with in that same case, there was also a lithograph showing a procession of Oddfellows,
Mhm.
and there's been an Oddfellows collar and a certificate from the Ancient Order of United Workmen in an exhibit that we have on American business.
Mhm.
And there's an 18th century Masonic snuff box that was sat alongside that uh, Mark jewel in our introductory timeline display. So I've been able to either recommend other curators or myself put it into exhibits that I'm working on, and really try and help make fraternal history a recognized part of American history.
Mhm.
That's been uh, really important to me, and I've had some good successes with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think the biggest challenge is kind of like the flip side of that. So, fraternal groups, Freemasonry, that this remains an important, it's an important aspect of the nation's history, but you know, fraternal groups are just not as ubiquitous and well known in today's culture as they were 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. So I mentioned before that I processed this firefighting collection, and I'm the
Mhm.
curator for firefighting here as well. And when I talk to people or write labels or do an exhibit about firefighting in America, um, I can assume that my audience knows what firefighting is. They
Mm.
know how it works. They might even have connections to active or retired firefighters. So I don't have to start from square one. I just can't make that same assumption when I talk about fraternal history,
Mhm.
right? So I need to get audiences to understand how Freemasonry and fraternal groups are important in American history. But to do that, I have to really go down to the fundamentals, like what
Mhm.
are they? What do they do?
Right.
Because people are just not as familiar with them as part of the cultural makeup of America anymore. Um, and if an audience, so like, if an audience has encountered any Masons, it's probably through popular culture. It's through something like National Treasure or Dan Brown's books, or harder yet, it's through conspiracy theories. So
Yeah.
you're not only trying to discuss something from brass tacks, you're also trying to unwind it from conspiracy
Yeah.
theory too, right? So you have to work with that. But I think that's important. You have to meet audiences where they are. You know, if you're going to engage with them about a subject, you have to engage them at a point of where they are, not where you wish they were, or not where you want them to be, and kind of build the education, in the topic from there. So that can be tough, and it changes. I can't give a fraternal talk to kindergartners in the same way I can about firefighting,
Right.
and I have, and I've
Right.
done firefighting talks. Um, so there's age differences, there's kind of education backgrounds, all these kind of things. If I was to give a talk to a group of older people my age or older, there's probably some familiarity there, but I'm still
Mhm.
probably working to explain it. So that's always a challenge, and it's one I always like to meet, and it's one that I think it's really good not only to say how important fraternalism is, but literally let people know what it is, and then give them that perspective to
Yeah.
then explore further.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So, where do you see the National Museum of American History and the Smithsonian going in the future? And what are your thoughts about getting more young people involved or in the Masonic Museum social media presence? What are your thoughts there?
It's I think there's an answer that cuts through all ways of that, all the points you just brought up in the question is that, and I think it's a real simple one. It's community, right?
Hmm.
Um, this museum is committed to helping our audiences shape the future by learning about the past. And so we're also committed to representing as many communities as possible um, that have helped create that history and helped bequeath the lessons of the past, right? So we're trying to tell a lot of different stories from lots of different groups. And we want to represent the histories and stories of these groups that in some cases haven't been part of the story of the larger American history.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, in my particular area, that includes communities of men and women who have formed around fraternal traditions, right?
Right.
So likewise, I think that's one of the potential appeals to Freemasonry and other fraternal groups, maybe an appeal to that they can become part of this inclusive community where
Mm-hmm.
they can grow as individuals and share experiences, have authentic, in-person experience,
Mm-hmm.
something that they might be lacking or might be less of an opportunity in their everyday lives. So, and social media creates communities too. It's one of the reasons that we have less interaction, but it does create more ties and more
Mm-hmm.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that can be part of the strategy as well. I think, so I think Masonry and other fraternal communities, as they adapt and if they can focus on, you know, on ways forward that are appealing or that are relevant to people today, um, that's where I'm really anxious to sort of collect in the future as well, to help tell that story of that evolution
Mm-hmm.
and to collect history as it's being made, not just history that's 100 or 200 years old,
Yeah.
collecting contemporaneously to
Right.
help show that fraternalism is still an important part in many Americans' lives and will continue to be.
Yeah, it's a part of community culture.
Yeah,
And all this is about communication. It's all about storytelling. I
yeah.
agree with you 100%. Well, Tim, thank you so much. I'd appreciate if you can give your website, location, and some contact information again for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So once again, our website is www.americanhistory.si.edu. And you can go there and find links to all types of things, our blog page, our collection search, all that kind of stuff. Um, and specifically, we're located at 14th and Constitution Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. It's right on the National Mall. Um, if you go to our website, there's a contact form if you have any general questions. Um, and if you want to contact me directly, my email is winklet, Winkle T, at si.edu. And I'm always happy to take inquiries or donation offers or whatever, and or just to give advice. So I try and be a resource for people, and I'm more than happy to hear from folks who have any questions.
Great, great. Very good. Thank you so much. And
Sure.
thank you all for listening to this podcast. Please look for future episodes as we dive deep into every sort of Masonic and fraternal repository and artifact and archive. So stay tuned. It's bound to be a fraternal good time. I've been Glenn Visscher from the Masonic Library Museum Association, and goodbye from us curators and librarians. And remember to preserve your Masonic history. Thanks, and take care.
This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment, while the Masonic Authors Guild International, the Masonic Library and Museum Association, and the Indiana University Center for Fraternal Collections and Research provides the most accurate information possible. Listeners use this information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are MAGI's properties, as are all the opinions and information it presents. Robert L.D. Cooper's, Mark A. Tabert's, and any other speakers' views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers in any way, shape, or form. MAGI, Cooper, or Tabert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you ever happen to suffer any inconvenience due to the information herein contained.